Welcome, curious minds, to a journey into one of the most astonishing paradoxes of World War II. What if everything you believed about your enemy was a lie? What if, in the crucible of global conflict, a nation decided to treat its adversaries with a level of dignity that defied all expectations, shattering years of ingrained propaganda? This isn't just a historical anecdote. It's a profound exploration of human nature, strategic foresight, and the subtle power of empathy in the face of unimaginable hatred. Imagine, for a moment, being a young German soldier in 1943. You've been fighting on the desolate battlefields of North Africa, or the sun-baked hills of Sicily. You've witnessed the brutal realities of war, the merciless logic of conflict. Your mind is saturated with images propagated by the Third Reich. The Americans, your enemy, depicted as barbaric, degenerate, a chaotic force bent on your destruction. You've seen how your own side treats its captives, and you expect nothing less, perhaps even worse, from these alleged savages. Then you are captured. The fighting stops. The uniforms change. You are herded onto convoys, transported across the vast, perilous Atlantic, a journey riddled with fear and uncertainty. Every fiber of your being is braced for the worst. Chains, starvation, forced labor under the watchful eyes of cruel guards, public humiliation, perhaps even torture. You envision a life of degradation, a stark testament to your defeat. But what if, upon arriving on enemy soil, the reality that unfolded before your eyes was so utterly different, so fundamentally contrary to everything you had been taught, that it would shake the very foundations of your worldview? What if, as you stepped off that train onto American soil, you found yourself walking freely, under escort, yes, but without the clinking of manacles, without the oppressive weight of chains? This single, almost mundane detail, the absence of physical restraint, was not just a convenience. It was a psychological earthquake that resonated through the minds of thousands of German prisoners of war, a symbol of a deeper, more profound truth that America sought to convey. This is the story of German POWs in World War II America, a chapter of history that often goes untold, yet holds immense lessons about the nature of conflict, the power of propaganda, and the enduring strength of humanitarian principles. It's a narrative that forces us to question our assumptions about wartime morality and the unexpected paths to reconciliation. So, lean in, because the truth, as it often does, is far stranger and more compelling than fiction. Chapter 1. The Unshackled Arrival. Disbelief on American soil. The year is 1943. The Battle of Tunisia has just concluded, sealing the fate of the formidable Africa Corps. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, once proud members of the Wehrmacht, now find themselves prisoners of war. Their journey to America wasn't a quick hop across a border. It was a long, arduous voyage across the submarine-infested waters of the Atlantic, a journey that in itself was a testament to the vast scale of the conflict. For many, this was their first time truly leaving Europe, heading towards a land they only knew through the distorted lens of Nazi propaganda. Upon disembarking from the ships at East Coast ports, such as New York and New Jersey, the initial processing began. This wasn't the chaotic, brutal scene they might have anticipated. Instead, it was a meticulous, almost bureaucratic ritual. Soldiers were fingerprinted. A uniform marked PW in stark black letters was issued, and detailed health inspections were conducted. This structured process, rather than immediate punishment, was the first hint that their captivity might be different. These processing centers, far from being mere holding cells, were designed with a surprising degree of adherence to international law. The United States Army was keenly aware of its obligations under the Geneva Convention of 1929. This wasn't just about altruism. It was a strategic decision to project an image of compliance and civilized warfare to the world, and, importantly, to ensure reciprocal treatment for American soldiers captured by the Axis powers. Food rations, a critical aspect for men who had often faced scarcity on the front lines, mirrored those of American troops. Basic amenities like soap, towels, and bedding were provided. For soldiers who had braced themselves for a subhuman existence, this treatment was disarming. It began to chip away at the hardened shell of their expectations. How could these barbaric Americans offer such provisions? Then came the inland journey. From the bustling ports, long trains carried them deep into the American heartland. Their destinations were sprawling camps in states like Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Iowa. These weren't dungeons. These were often newly constructed facilities, resembling small, self-contained towns. Wooden barracks, mess halls, canteens, and even chapels lined the grounds. The irony was palpable. In a land they were taught to despise, they were being housed in functional, if fenced, communities. But the ultimate shock, the detail that would etch itself into their memories and later be recounted in memoirs and letters, occurred as they prepared for work assignments or escorted visits. The American guards, many of them young men themselves, established a clear yet courteous authority. When the time came to march out, there was no metallic clang of chains, no shackles binding their wrists or ankles. Instead, the German prisoners walked in orderly groups, watched, certainly, but unbound. This absence of physical restraint was profoundly disorienting. For men accustomed to the iron-fisted discipline of the Wehrmacht, where captives were often subjected to ruthless treatment, the lack of manacles suggested an entirely different philosophy. It wasn't just about physical freedom. It was about a perceived respect, a recognition of their humanity, however grudgingly given by their captors. This single detail spoke volumes, hinting at a world far removed from the one painted by Dr. Goebbels's propaganda machine. The foundation of their deeply held beliefs about America was starting to crack, not with a bang, but with the quiet, unsettling absence of a chain. Chapter 2. The Logic of Dignity. Beyond simple kindness. To understand why the United States adopted such an unexpected approach, we must delve deeper than simple humanitarianism, though that certainly played a part. America's strategy towards its POWs was a complex weave of legal obligations, economic necessities, strategic foresight, and a powerful desire to uphold its democratic ideals on the world stage. The Geneva Convention of 1929, an international treaty outlining the rights and duties of prisoners of war, was the bedrock of this policy. The U.S. military, even in the throes of total war, was meticulous in its adherence. Why? Firstly, it was a matter of moral standing. America aimed to be seen as a beacon of democracy and civilized conduct, a stark contrast to the totalitarian regimes of Germany and Japan. Violating international law would not only undermine this image, but also provide ammunition for enemy propaganda. Secondly, and perhaps more pragmatically, there was the principle of reciprocity. American soldiers were fighting and being captured in Europe and the Pacific. Treating German prisoners humanely created a strong precedent and moral leverage for demanding similar treatment for Allied captives. If the U.S. began to abuse its prisoners, it risked inviting retaliatory brutality against its own servicemen. This wasn't just speculation. It was a very real fear that shaped policy. Beyond the legal and reciprocal aspects, there was a profound economic imperative. By 1943, millions of American men were serving overseas. Farms and industries back home faced crippling labor shortages. The solution, surprising as it might seem, lay in the very enemy they were fighting. German POWs, numbering nearly 400,000 by mid-war, represented a vast, untapped workforce. Utilizing them, however, required a system that maintained morale and productivity, not one that relied on demoralizing brute force. This is where the no-chains policy truly shone as a stroke of strategic genius. Humiliation and physical degradation are counterproductive to efficiency. A prisoner treated with some measure of dignity, even within the confines of captivity, is more likely to be compliant, more productive, and less prone to desperate escape attempts. The U.S. Army understood that discipline could be maintained through structured oversight and clear rules, rather than constant physical intimidation. They were not aiming for re-education through kindness, but rather aiming for efficient labor while upholding principles. Moreover, this approach served as a powerful counter-narrative to Nazi propaganda. German soldiers had been fed a steady diet of lies about the barbaric Americans. Each humane interaction, each unchained walk through a quiet American town, each glimpse of a functioning, prosperous society eroded that fiction. It sowed seeds of doubt not just in the minds of the prisoners, but also, as we'll explore later, in the minds of their families back home. The psychological impact of seeing a thriving, ordered society, seemingly untouched by the war that was tearing their own country apart, was immeasurable. It challenged their deepest indoctrinations. The decision to treat prisoners with respect wasn't a passive act. It was an active demonstration of confidence. America's system of order and its democratic values were so robust, military strategists reasoned, that they did not need to shackle their enemies in public. This displayed a strength that went beyond military might, a strength of moral conviction and systemic stability. It conveyed a message that was far more potent than any propaganda broadcast. America could afford to be humane because its foundations were strong and its cause just. This calculated confidence formed the ethical and practical framework for an extraordinary chapter in wartime history. Rutgers. Chapter 3. Harvesting. Hope, Work Details, and the American Landscape. The pressing labor shortages in wartime America meant that German POWs quickly transitioned from idle captives to an essential part of the domestic workforce. This was not a punitive measure, but a pragmatic solution to a national crisis, authorized by the War Manpower Commission. The scale of their employment was vast, spanning dozens of states and encompassing a wide array of tasks. The bulk of German labor was absorbed by agriculture. Imagine fields stretching endlessly across the American Midwest. Cotton, corn, sugar beets, wheat. Harvest seasons, critical for feeding both the nation and its troops abroad, would have collapsed without these hands. American men were overseas, and while mechanization was advancing, it couldn't fully compensate for the sheer demand for manual labor. So, German POWs were bused or marched daily to these fields, often supervised by just one or two armed guards. Here again, the absence of chains was striking. These men, who just months earlier were wielding rifles against American forces, were now entrusted with farm tools, hoes, shovels, even driving tractors. This was a peculiar form of captivity indeed. Farmers who worked alongside them often recalled their diligence, their work ethic. Was it the prospect of better food rations that motivated them? Or perhaps the simple, inherent human desire for meaningful work, a sense of purpose that war had stripped away. For many, the opportunity to work outdoors, to feel the sun on their faces, and to contribute to something tangible, however paradoxical, was a welcome reprieve from the monotony of camp life. One former prisoner, recounting his experience working on a sugar beet farm in Nebraska, described the overwhelming scale of American agriculture. He had grown up on a small family farm in Bavaria where every acre was meticulously tended. Here, he saw fields that seemed to stretch to the horizon, operated by machinery so large it dwarfed anything he had ever imagined. He famously described a combine harvester as a machine the size of a house. This wasn't just work. It was a cultural education in the sheer productive capacity of the American nation, a stark contrast to the increasingly desperate agricultural situation in war-torn Germany. Industrial employment also emerged, albeit under stricter regulations to comply with the Geneva Convention's prohibition against using POWs directly for armaments. Still, their labor indirectly sustained the war effort. In lumber mills, canneries, and small factories producing non-military goods, German captives provided vital support. In Wisconsin, they aided paper mills. In Michigan, they worked in remote logging operations. Again, they were entrusted with saws, axes, and heavy machinery, a testament to the American confidence that order could be maintained without constant, visible coercion. Escape attempts were rare, partly because the vast, unfamiliar American landscape made the futility of such endeavors clear, but also because the system fostered a subtle sense of mutual expectation. The financial arrangements reinforced this strange equilibrium. Prisoners didn't receive direct wages, but they were credited with small amounts of canteen pay. This money could be used within the camps to purchase toiletries, writing paper, or even small luxuries like cigarettes and candy. Farmers and local contractors, in turn, paid a fixed rate to the U.S. government for each worker. This formalized, regulated system stood in stark contrast to the forced labor practices prevalent in Europe, where prisoners were often exploited without any compensation or dignity. These work details became more than just labor. They were immersive experiences, offering a unique window into American life. Prisoners saw communities functioning, observed the rhythm of rural existence, and interacted, however minimally, with civilians. They witnessed firsthand the resilience and ingenuity of a nation mobilizing for war, a nation that could feed itself and its allies even while fighting a global conflict. The paradox was profound. Enemies of the state, yet trusted with valuable tools and freedom of movement, contributing to the very economy that fueled the war against their homeland. This reliance on efficiency, rather than brute repression, left a deep, lasting impression, challenging their ingrained notions of power and control. Chapter 4. Unshackled Spectators. Town Visits and a World Undreamed of. For many German soldiers, the most surreal and impactful experience of their captivity was the escorted visit to American towns. Stepping beyond the camp fences, not in chains or under heavy guard, but walking along quiet streets, under the gaze of a handful of escorts, shattered every preconceived notion. It was a journey into a world they had been told did not exist, a reality so different from the one portrayed by Nazi propaganda that it bordered on the fantastical. Nazi ideology had painted the United States as a land of chaos, crime, and racial strife, a decadent society on the verge of collapse. Yet what unfolded before their eyes were clean sidewalks, bustling shops, and civilians who seemed more curious than hostile. These were often rural communities, unscarred by bombing raids, unlike the ruined cities of Germany. Streets were intact, buildings stood tall, and life continued with a sense of prosperity that was unimaginable in war-torn Europe. Imagine the sensory overload for these men. The sights, shops overflowing with goods, butter, fresh meat, canned fruits, cigarettes, items that had become unimaginable luxuries, almost mythical back home under strict rationing and blockades. Even with American rationing in place, the abundance was overwhelming. They could stop and stare into shop windows, observing advertisements for products they hadn't seen in years. The sounds, popular songs drifting from open windows, the clatter of silverware from diners, the murmur of everyday conversations. Names like Bing Crosby or the Glenn Miller Orchestra were alien to them, a stark contrast to the martial marches and state-approved folk tunes they were accustomed to. The smell of fresh coffee wafting from a cafe, the aroma of baked goods from a bakery. These were small, everyday details that spoke volumes about a society that was not just surviving, but thriving. One former prisoner recalled his profound shock at seeing American couples strolling hand in hand, seemingly unconcerned about air raids or curfews. To him, the absence of visible fear, the everyday tranquility, was the greatest contrast with Germany, where civilian life was constantly overshadowed by the omnipresent reminders of war. This mundane normalcy was a powerful form of cultural education. The lack of chains wasn't merely practical, it carried immense symbolic weight. It suggested trust, a calculated confidence by the American authorities that these men, despite being enemies, would adhere to rules. It conveyed a message that America's system of order was so strong, so fundamentally stable, that it did not need to resort to the visible humiliation of its captives. For men raised under a regime that relied on constant intimidation and fear, this was a revelation. It presented an alternative model of authority, one based on expectation and implicit trust rather than overt coercion. Newspaper editorials sometimes voiced concerns, asking why enemies were granted such freedoms. But military officials consistently reassured communities that security was intact. The vastness of the American landscape, combined with the realization among prisoners that escape was futile, meant the system worked. These town visits became routine over time, but the astonishment never completely faded for the men involved. The first step onto American streets, unshackled yet still prisoners, remained a symbol of a strange paradox. Confined, yet given glimpses of liberty, more generous than many had ever known under their own government, or indeed than many other captives experienced globally during that brutal conflict. It was a potent, unscripted counter-narrative to years of propaganda, a living, breathing testament to a different kind of society. Chapter 5. unfamiliar faces, civilian encounters, and a tapestry of reactions. The presence of German prisoners of war, identifiable by their uniforms, often dyed to stand out, and escorted by American guards, inevitably drew strong reactions from the civilian population. For many Americans, seeing these men, who, just months ago, might have been firing on their sons, brothers, or fathers overseas, strolling through their neighborhoods was unsettling, to say the least. Yet, despite the initial shock and underlying anxieties, communities gradually adapted, their responses forming a complex tapestry of suspicion, curiosity, pragmatism, and even occasional compassion. Newspaper articles from the period often captured these mixed emotions. Local editorials in Midwestern states sometimes expressed surprise, even concern, that enemy soldiers were allowed such relatively light supervision. Questions arose. Was this policy too lenient? Especially when news of Allied casualties filled the daily headlines, fueling grief and resentment. However, military officials consistently reiterated that the prisoners were unarmed, outnumbered, and faced the near impossibility of escape across vast American territory. They also emphasized the critical economic role of POW labor, particularly in agriculture, reassuring the public that security protocols were robust. Civilians who had direct contact with the prisoners, especially farmers, often exhibited a pragmatic acceptance. They knew these men were crucial for bringing in the harvest. Oral histories reveal instances where farmers, despite the wartime context, shared extra food or coffee with the German laborers during breaks, small gestures of human recognition that transcended the enemy combatant designation. These interactions were less about ideology and more about shared toil, a common humanity found in the rhythm of farm work. Town residents who saw groups of prisoners passing by often whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution. Rarely, however, did these observations escalate into open confrontation or violence. Americans, by and large, tended to observe quietly, their suspicion tempered by the understanding that these men were defeated, contained, and no longer an immediate threat. However, the emotional landscape was not always so subdued. For families who had lost loved ones in North Africa or Europe, the sight of former enemies walking freely down their streets could rekindle profound grief and anger. Some communities did protest publicly, writing letters to local authorities demanding stricter controls. In isolated cases, individuals might shout insults or refuse to interact with businesses that employed German laborers. These tensions underscore the delicate balance the government had to maintain, reassuring a grieving public while simultaneously leveraging POW labor to keep essential industries functioning. It was a testament to the strain wartime put on the national psyche. Interestingly, children often played a unique role in bridging this divide. Accounts tell of youngsters waving at the prisoners, sometimes attempting to practice German phrases they might have heard, or simply following them out of wide-eyed curiosity. Former POWs later remembered these interactions fondly, recalling how American children laughed and asked questions, gestures that softened the strangeness and isolation of captivity. For civilians, watching their children interact without fear often reinforced the perception that these men, though once dangerous opponents, no longer posed a threat. The innocence of youth cut through the adult complexities of war. Religious and civic organizations also became involved. The YMCA and local church groups occasionally organized events that included German POWs under escort, such as concerts or educational programs. Though often controversial, these activities reflected a broader American ethos of adhering to humanitarian principles, even in the midst of war. Reports from towns like Alona, Iowa, even detail Christmas pageants where POWs and civilians jointly participated, creating a remarkable, almost unbelievable scene of former enemies sharing holiday traditions under the watchful eyes of guards. A striking and often uncomfortable paradox emerged from these interactions, particularly for African American communities. Many observers noted the irony that German captives, treated with relative dignity and granted freedoms like unchained movement, sometimes experienced more lenient conditions than black citizens facing segregation and systemic discrimination at home. This stark contrast was not lost on those who witnessed it, and served as a powerful, if unspoken, critique of the racial injustices prevalent in wartime America. It highlighted the complicated, often contradictory layers of American social life during that tumultuous era. Overall, the civilian reactions were neither uniformly hostile nor uniformly welcoming. They spanned a spectrum from cautious acceptance to simmering resentment, shaped by individual experiences, profound wartime losses, and immediate local needs. What remained extraordinary was the simple fact that American communities, despite their grievances, largely tolerated and often relied upon the presence of enemy soldiers moving unchained through their streets. This remarkable circumstance left indelible impressions on both sides of the experience, a testament to the complexities of human response during extraordinary times. Chapter 6. A Window to Another World. Cultural Immersion and the Seeds of Change. Beyond the demanding work assignments and the often cautious civilian encounters, daily life for German prisoners of war in America offered an unexpected immersion into American culture. When escorted groups left their camps for labor or errands, they inevitably absorbed aspects of local traditions, entertainment, and habits. Over time, this cultural exposure became as influential as the physical freedoms, subtly reshaping their perception of the country and its people. Music, that universal language, played a particularly striking role. American popular culture in the 1940s was dominated by swing and jazz, vibrant, improvisational sounds that contrasted sharply with the rigid, state-approved marches and folk tunes of the Third Reich. These rhythms drifted into the camps through radios or during visits to town. Glenn Miller's orchestra, Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington. These were household names to Americans, but exotic and fascinating to Germans. Many POWs were captivated to hear such lively music while walking past cafes or encountering jukeboxes in small-town diners. The very idea that such expressive, often spontaneous music was part of daily life spoke volumes about a culture far removed from the controlled artistic environment they had known. It was an unfiltered glimpse into a society that valued individual expression and leisure, even amidst the global conflict. Sports provided another curious window. In states like Iowa and Texas, prisoners would see posters advertising baseball games, sometimes even having the opportunity to organize matches within the camps using donated equipment. Guards occasionally arranged informal scrimmages between American units and German prisoners, a practice documented in camp newsletters. For the Germans, baseball, with its unfamiliar rules and terminology, seemed alien at first, yet it symbolized leisure, camaraderie, and a distinctly American form of national identity. observing Americans passionately engaged in a sport that had no military purpose emphasized to the prisoners the cultural depth and normalcy of their captors' society. It was a powerful counter-narrative to the relentless militarization of life in Nazi Germany. Educational opportunities also became a significant part of this cultural exchange. Many camps, often with support from the YMCA or local schools, offered English language classes. When prisoners were escorted into libraries or permitted to receive books, they encountered a wide range of literature, from American history to contemporary novels. A number of German officers within the camps even encouraged their men to utilize these resources, hoping to maintain discipline through intellectual engagement. Some prisoners returned home after the war with a surprising fluency in English, a skill acquired during their captivity. This intellectual freedom, paired with escorted access to libraries and classrooms, sharply underscored the contrast with the authoritarian restrictions and book burnings they had previously known. Religious life was also respected, a particularly poignant observation for men coming from a regime that had increasingly sought to control or suppress religious expression. Catholic priests and Protestant ministers from nearby communities were allowed to visit camps, and sometimes prisoners escorted to town could attend services under guard. This was an unexpected dimension of cultural exposure. To worship openly in churches alongside civilians, witnessing a respect for religious practice that extended even to enemy soldiers. This deeply impressed many Germans who had witnessed state interference in their faith during the Nazi era. Daily civilian interactions, though often limited and cautious, left lasting impressions. Prisoners walking through towns were sometimes approached by curious residents who attempted broken conversations or offered small tokens like apples or newspapers. In rare cases, shopkeepers discreetly sold goods to POWs under guard, while others maintained a cautious distance. These fleeting moments, however brief, demonstrated to the Germans that American society was not uniformly hostile toward them. Despite the raging conflict overseas, it revealed a nuanced populace, capable of differentiating between political adversaries and individual human beings. Perhaps the most powerful cultural exposure, however, was the pervasive sense of normalcy itself. Watching families gather for church on Sunday, seeing children walk to school unafraid of bombings, observing couples shopping in stores overflowing with goods, all of this was cultural education by observation. It conveyed a vision of stability, prosperity, and a resilient democracy that, while at war, was not consumed by it. For German soldiers raised under years of authoritarian rule and incessant propaganda, these escorted glimpses of American life offered a startling counterpoint to everything they had been taught. It was a subtle, yet profound indoctrination into the practical workings and inherent values of a democratic society, leaving an indelible mark that would shape their perspectives long after the war's end. Chapter 7. Letters. Home. Whispers of abundance across the ocean. Under the provisions of the Geneva Convention, every prisoner of war was allowed to send letters home several times a month. These letters, carefully censored by U.S. officials before being sent overseas, became a crucial, often bewildering, lifeline between the captives and their families in Germany. Preserved in archives and family collections, these documents offer rare, first-hand testimony of what it was like to walk through American towns unchained, and how prisoners themselves grappled with reconciling the bizarre reality around them with the fabricated image of America they had once carried in their minds. Many accounts in these letters describe an almost incredulous disbelief at encountering abundance and order. A soldier from the Afrika Korps, writing to his family in Bavaria in late 1943, expressed his astonishment. "We are taken outside without chains, only with guards. The people look at us, but they do not harm us." Such simple observations, seemingly mundane, were radical departures from the propaganda he had absorbed. Another letter might mention seeing shops filled with meat, bread, fruit, and tobacco, items that by then had become scarce, almost mythical, in German cities suffering under Allied blockades and relentless bombing. The mere sight of well-stocked store windows became a recurring theme, almost an obsession, as prisoners used cautious wording to describe how dramatically it differed from the scarcity and hardship back home. They walked past store aisles brimming with goods, while their families were rationing scraps. This visual dissonance was a powerful, silent communicator. Prisoners frequently compared their treatment with what they knew of how captives were handled in Europe. Several recalled the horrific conditions faced by French and Soviet prisoners in German camps, often forced into hard labor under brutal conditions, starved and abused. In stark contrast, the Americans not only provided a small stipend, but also allowed supervised excursions beyond the wire. One former soldier, in a 1944 letter, noted, "We are treated more like workers than prisoners." The American censors, likely understanding the strategic impact, allowed such phrases to pass, knowing they would have a profound effect when read in Germany. These seemingly innocuous sentences were psychological warfare in reverse, undermining enemy morale from within. The letters also revealed deeply personal reflections and internal struggles. Some men admitted to profound confusion, questioning whether they had been fundamentally misled by Nazi propaganda. A Bavarian farmer captured in Tunisia wrote, "They said Americans were criminals and savages. Yet here, even the guards speak kindly. It is hard to understand." This wasn't merely a factual observation. It was a crisis of belief, a direct challenge to the ideological foundation of their upbringing. Another letter, preserved in a family archive in Württemberg, described how prisoners were allowed to attend church services in town under guard, an experience the writer called the most human treatment I have ever seen. These deeply personal, almost vulnerable admissions underscore the power of direct experience to dismantle years of indoctrination. Of course, not all letters painted a rosy picture. Some prisoners expressed boredom, isolation, or the deep frustration of long separation from loved ones. Others hinted at resentment, noting that their labor was being used to support the enemy's economy. Still, the dominant tone was one of genuine surprise and often bewilderment at the level of trust shown during their excursions. The simple absence of chains seemed to symbolize a broader difference in ideology, a belief in order maintained by confidence and adherence to principles, rather than by constant fear and brute force. After the war, many veterans recalled that writing about these experiences was a crucial way of processing them. Some were cautious, knowing their words would be scrutinized, but others inserted subtle hints that life in captivity had profoundly reshaped their worldview. Oral histories collected decades later often referenced those letters as the moment when prisoners first admitted, even to themselves, that America was not what they had been taught to believe. For their families back in Germany, receiving such letters must have been profoundly bewildering. They lived under constant bombing, severe rationing, and strict censorship, facing unimaginable hardship. Meanwhile, their sons wrote about towns where food was plentiful, and guards trusted captives to walk unshackled in public. This stark contrast not only preserved morale among the prisoners, offering them a glimmer of hope and a sense of being treated as humans, but also planted potent seeds of doubt in the minds of the families who read them. In this way, the written word became as powerful as the lived experience itself, carrying across the Atlantic the incredible story of a captivity unlike any they could have possibly imagined, slowly chipping away at the edifice of propaganda, one letter at a time. Chapter 8. The Return and the Echoes of Unchained Memories. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the German prisoners who had spent years in the United States faced a difficult and often traumatic transition, returning to a homeland in ruins. By 1946, large-scale repatriation began, with transports moving thousands of former captives from American camps back to a devastated Europe. Yet, what they carried with them was more than just memories of confinement. It was the indelible impression of a society that had allowed them to walk unchained through its towns, labor on its farms, and witness a daily life that seemed miraculously untouched by the destruction consuming their own country. Many of these returning men found themselves in a Germany utterly unrecognizable from the one they had left. Cities such as Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden lay in smoking ruins, flattened by relentless Allied bombing. Families struggled with acute shortages of food, housing, and basic necessities, grappling with the trauma of defeat and the immense task of rebuilding from scratch. Against this grim backdrop, the stories told by returning POWs about their time in the United States sounded almost fantastical. They spoke of walking past shops filled with goods, of being allowed to listen to American music, of seeing communities where families lived in peace and prosperity despite the war raging thousands of miles away. To their compatriots, these accounts often seemed implausible, even disloyal. So vast was the gulf between German hardship and American abundance that many found it difficult, if not impossible, to believe. The cognitive dissonance was immense, a chasm between the collective trauma of defeat and the individual experience of humane captivity. The memory of trust, symbolized by the absence of chains, remained central to these reflections. Former prisoners emphasized how remarkable it had been to be escorted into towns without physical restraints. For men raised in a regime where fear and coercion were daily tools of governance, the idea that authority could be exercised without constant intimidation made a profound and lasting impression. Several post-war memoirs described this as a turning point in their understanding of democracy, a system that maintained discipline not by chaining its enemies, but by expecting them to follow rules within a framework of respect and order. It was a lived lesson in the practical application of liberal values. Historians note that this exposure had subtle but deeply lasting effects on post-war German society. Some former POWs, profoundly influenced by their experiences, became teachers, community leaders, or businessmen. They carried with them the lessons they had observed in captivity, often contrasting American practices of fairness, organization, and democratic governance with the authoritarian structures of their past. Oral histories collected in the 1980s and 1990s vividly show that many men considered their years in the United States formative, shaping their views of democracy, civic engagement, and even influencing their support for West Germany's alignment with the Western Bloc during the Cold War. Their personal stories became threads in the larger tapestry of Germany's post-war identity, contributing to its eventual embrace of democratic institutions. The impressions also affected how these men remembered their captors. Instead of recounting bitterness or hatred, many expressed genuine gratitude for being treated according to the Geneva Convention. The stories of town visits, work details, and civilian encounters were retold to children and grandchildren, not as tales of suffering, but as examples of unexpected humanity in the midst of global conflict. The absence of chains in those memories became a powerful symbol of the wider differences they had experienced. Contrasts between propaganda and reality, repression and trust, destruction and abundance. It highlighted the profound disparity between what they had been told about America and what they had personally witnessed. Yet, the transition was not without its complexities and challenges. Some former POWs struggled deeply to reconcile their positive experiences in America with the devastation and moral reckoning they found at home. For those who returned to Soviet-occupied zones, sharing such Western-influenced stories could even be dangerous, as authorities were suspicious of anyone who might have been swayed by Western ideals. Others found that neighbors and family members scarred by bombings, loss, and the collapse of their nation were unwilling to hear about decent treatment by the enemy. As a result, many suppressed their memories for decades, only speaking openly and freely about their captivity in later life, when the wounds of war had begun to heal and the political landscape had stabilized. Despite these challenges, the legacy of their captivity remained clear. The extraordinary fact that German soldiers, once combatants against the United States, had walked freely through American towns without chains, became a narrative that endured across generations. It illustrated a profound paradox of the Second World War, that even in the midst of bitter existential fighting, there existed moments of humanity that defied all expectations, challenging the very definition of enemy and shaping the course of post-war reconciliation. It was a testament to the belief that even in war, there are higher principles to uphold, principles that can, in the long run, lay the groundwork for a more peaceful and understanding world. Conclusion: the enduring power of human dignity. The story of German POWs walking unchained through American towns during World War II is far more than a historical footnote. It is a profound lesson woven into the fabric of human conflict. It challenges our deepest assumptions about war, about enemies, and about the strategic value of human dignity. This wasn't merely an act of kindness. It was a calculated, multifaceted policy rooted in legal obligations, economic necessity, and a far-sighted understanding of geopolitics and human psychology. At its core, this narrative underscores the immense power of direct experience to dismantle even the most deeply ingrained propaganda. For years, these young German men had been fed a steady diet of lies, painting their adversaries as barbaric monsters. But what they encountered in America, the abundance in shops, the order in towns, the courtesy of guards, the freedom from shackles, was an undeniable, lived reality that shattered those fictions. It taught them, not through lectures or forced re-education, but through observation and experience, that the world was far more nuanced and complex than their authoritarian regime had led them to believe. The lesson for us, decades later, is clear and resonant. In any conflict, in any interaction with an adversary, the choice of how we treat our enemies speaks volumes about who we are. America's adherence to the Geneva Convention, even under immense wartime pressure, showcased a nation confident in its values, willing to demonstrate that strength did not require brutality. It proved that control could be maintained through order and cooperation, rather than constant force and humiliation. This approach yielded tangible benefits, from vital labor to intelligence. But more importantly, it sowed seeds of doubt and respect that contributed to post-war reconciliation and the eventual alignment of a democratic West Germany with the very nations it had once fought. This narrative reminds us that empathy, even towards those we perceive as enemies, is not a weakness but a strategic asset. It highlights the profound impact of upholding humanitarian principles, not just as a moral imperative, but as a practical pathway to long-term peace and understanding. The absence of chains became a potent symbol, not just of physical freedom, but of an ideological freedom, an invitation to reconsider one's worldview. In an age still grappling with conflict, misinformation, and the dehumanization of adversaries, this historical account serves as a powerful testament. It asks us to look beyond the rhetoric, to question the narratives, and to recognize the shared humanity that can, even in the darkest hours, bridge divides. The German POWs who walked unchained through America's heartland returned home forever changed, becoming quiet ambassadors of a different way of life. Their experiences serve as an enduring reminder that how we treat our captives, our enemies, and indeed each other, ultimately defines us, leaving a legacy that echoes far beyond the battlefield.